Who is this who comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah? He who is splendid in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It is I, speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like his who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. I trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath. Their lifeblood spattered on my garments and stained all my apparel. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption had come. I looked, but there was no one to help. I was appalled, but there was no one to uphold. So my own arm brought me salvation, and my wrath upheld me. I trampled down the peoples in my anger. I made them drunk in my wrath, and I poured out their lifeblood on the earth. Isaiah 63, 1 through 6.
You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm your host, Zelwyn Heide, here today with David Appold to continue our discussion on the book of Revelation. David, how are you doing?
Doing great. Zelwyn, good to be on with you. Good to be back. Too bad Willie's not here.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I was kind of hoping that he could be with us, but that's just the way it went today. He was unable to be with us, and we'll just have to carry on alone. I'm not sure how we'll do it, but we'll manage somehow, right?
He sends power.
He's probably gone off onto some vision quest again, and will come back bearing more answers than before.
Now that he's in Arkansas, though, his growing season is extremely long. He might be getting his gourd patch already.
Already sitting under the earliest of his gourds.
Yeah.
I can get behind that. How's the weather out your way?
Oh, Paducah, spring is in the air. It's coming. We had a big ice snowstorm. You know, the weatherman now exerts incredible control over people's minds and forms mass mind control. I don't know. We have to pay attention to the weatherman very closely, of course. But we had a big ice and snowstorm for us, anyways, last week. And it's all now melting away. I think the high today, as we're recording, is supposed to be maybe even close to 60. So sun is shining, snow is melting, ice is gone. The birds are chirping. I saw a robin, which is, of course, the harbinger of spring. So it's right around the corner for me, Zelwyn.
I like how you have all of this hopeful, very optimistic kind of outlook right now, very cheery, very spring oriented. And now I'm going to come in and be like, yeah, it's still winter.
Yeah. Well, we start with reading, who is this who comes from Bozrah? And then you transition into, so we like to have that extreme swing of things on Word Fitly.
It's true. The weather out this way it's been a little warm lately. A lot of the ice that was kind of plaguing us last week has started to melt away, which is very helpful because I know that our parking lot here at the church was pretty much a skating rink there for most of last week, which thankfully nobody injured themselves or got into any accident, but it wasn't pretty. But now things have warmed up a little bit and things have melted down, but we still have a lot of snow on the ground. Spring is a long ways off for us yet, David.
Yeah, it's coming for us. I think the groundhog went back. Did he see his shadow? I think he did.
Don't know.
I think I had heard that Punxsutawney Phil went back into his hole. So, but like I said, I saw the robin, and I don't know. Adam could give us a better sense of how to read these signs, but I trust the birds, the blessed birds, more than the groundhog.
That's probably fair. But anyway, we should probably get rolling on our discussion today. So we're continuing our discussion on the book of Revelation. And last time we had talked about chapter 13, which of course is one of the key chapters in the entire book, talking about the vision of the two beasts and stuff like that. All of this, of course, was flowing out of the earlier discussion in chapter 12 about the war between the dragon and the children of the woman. But now, as we come into chapter 14, what's going on here, David? Can you give us a general overview of this chapter before we get into the details.
Sure. Chapter 14 is if you just stopped at chapter 13, you would draw the conclusion that there's kind of no hope for the saints. So the dragon from chapter 12 tried to eat up the son of the woman, but he was taken up into heaven. And then she went out into the wilderness, and the dragon pursued her, raised up his beasts, and then everybody got the mark of the beast. That's how chapter 13 ended. So if you just stop there, you miss what the saints are actually doing to combat the beast, and to, what hope is there for those who don't receive the mark of the beast. And I think chapter 14, we should read it as the conclusion of the end, at least of this part of the vision from chapter 12, 13, and 14. Now we're going to see who are those who didn't receive the mark, and how do they resist the dragon, and what is the conclusion of that warfare, of that fight. So it's a picture of the church militant and the promised victory that comes in the fight against the dragon.
Sure. And you can see, especially because in the beginning of chapter 15, John will say that I saw another vision. So he makes a very clear break, a very clear transition there. And I do think it is very reasonable to take these 3 chapters as one entire unit that helps us to understand what it is that's happening, not in heaven, but actually on earth, the war on earth, right?
Yeah, and I think, you don't want to say that like one part of the book is more important than another, and I think it's all building towards the end in chapters 20 through 22, but chapters 12 through 14 are really, I think it's the kind of the heart of the book. And as you think about John writing this to the church that's heavily persecuted, to those 7, the 7 cities that get mentioned early in the book, here is the call for perseverance. He doesn't sugarcoat things. He doesn't say it's not going to be that bad, guys. But it is good for us to read chapter 14 and not just stop at 13, which has all the juicy details about the beast and the image of the beast and the mark of the beast. That's what people get fascinated by. And then sadly, they often stop in the book, and it's just, who's ever heard of chapter 14?
Right. Yeah, it's one of those chapters that just doesn't get a lot of attention, unfortunately. So let's dig into the chapter a little bit, start getting a little bit of detail. We have the vision where the Lamb is standing on Mount Zion, which I think is significant, and with him are the 144,000. So what is happening in the first part of this chapter? What is the vision which John sees?
Yeah, so he just got done describing those who had the mark of the beast, and he gives the number for the beast, the number of the beast. And then in chapter 14, we have the opposing army, right? If you want to think of it as 2 armies here, the army of the beast and the army of the Lamb. So the Lamb and his 144,000, they have, instead of the mark of the beast, they have the name of the Lamb and his father's name written on their foreheads. So that you have these two armies. That's the vision. So you've got these 2 armies, and the number certainly jumps out, 144,000. This is not the first time in John's Revelation that we've seen that number before, and especially not the first time that we've seen 144,000 with some kind of mark on them. So this goes all the way back to chapter 7, where you have the angel going out into the world and marking, the 144,000, 12,000 from every tribe of Israel. And now we see what they are. He's marking them there to protect them in chapter 7. But now they're not just those who are protected. They're those who stand with the Lamb, and they're part of his army.
Right. Yeah, and this army, we see them basically engaged in a kind of worship. They're singing the new song before the throne, and no one can learn that song except those who have been redeemed from the earth. They are pure. They follow after the Lamb. The whole image is contrary to what we've seen before, where you have those who are defiled, those who are corrupted, those who follow the beast. Right.
Yeah, right. And it's again, of course, in the book of Revelation, these things are symbolic of deeper things, or maybe deeper, don't push too hard on that word, but saying that they're virgins, that they're pure. This is talking about, it's not necessarily that they're unmarried people, right? We don't want to take it literalistically, but what it means here, that they're pure, that they're virginal, is that they have not engaged in idolatry. So throughout Scripture, idolatry goes along with adultery quite frequently, and that's what's being described here for why they're pure.
Right. Well, and in that sense, the mark of the beast in the previous chapter is a kind of adultery, right? It is a spiritual adultery, because they are turning away from God and going after these strange women. If you want to, I mean, if you want to use that imagery, they
Yeah,
are.
and
Go ahead.
well, and just think, we know how as the book goes on, as the revelation goes on, the enemy of God's people is described as a great whore, the whore of Babylon. So those who are virginal are those who have not, they've not sullied themselves with the whore of Babylon. And, they're not engaged in any kind of adulterous spiritual practice, which could include, actual acts of adultery, but it could here be things like the imperial cult. It could be things like, returning back to the synagogue, or going back to the temple and to the sacrificial system that has been done away with. It could be any of those things.
Now, should we understand the 144,000 as a particular group? Like, is this like a specific part of the church, or should we see ourselves within this group as well?
That's a good question. This goes, when we were doing chapter 7, you might recall this conversation that we had. Typically the way that I've often heard chapter 7 interpreted is you've got the 144,000 who are the Jewish Christians, right? Those who are physically of the descended from Israel. And then in chapter 7, remember, John then sees the great multitude that no one could number. And that's then sometimes described as the Gentile portion of the church, that the Gentiles, you have both Jew and Gentile. I think it's probably just as well to see in chapter 7 the 144,000 as not being specifically Jewish Christians, and then the Gentiles who you see later, but it's just a way of speaking of the true Israel, as St. Paul would say in Romans, or is it in Ephesians there, where he talks about the Israel of God. That might be Galatians. So I would see the 144,000 as the whole, it's the church on earth. It's the church militant.
Right. As opposed to the church triumphant, of course, which is the language that's often used.
Yeah.
So we have here the church at war, the church at war with the beast, at war with the dragon, at war with all of these things, as we're going to see also in a little bit, at war with Babylon and all of those things. But I mean, it is a church that is fighting. It is a church that is struggling. And for that reason, yeah, I do think that we can see ourselves within this group, those who have faith in Jesus, those who are, who keep the commandments of God. They are the ones who are standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion.
Well, and their warfare is being carried out in worship, right? It's not, you don't have, at least not yet, you don't have any kind of conflict with the beast. You don't have any kind of conflict with the image of the beast, except that it's, I guess it would be implied, right? Is that those who have worshipped the beast, those who sing the song of the beast, they don't know the song of the Lamb. And so, how Christians engage in the warfare, the militant struggle of the church, I don't know if we want to say first and foremost, but a primary consideration here is that they engage in worship. They're involved they're participants in the worship life of the congregation, and that actually is part of the spiritual warfare.
Well, because that act of worship is itself a declaration of war. War against the world, war against the devil, war against, all of these things, because it's basically saying my allegiance is over here and it's not over here, right?
Yeah, I think allegiance is a great word for the book of Revelation. It comes up quite frequently, and it doesn't ever use the word allegiance, but I think that taps into a lot of what Revelation is instilling in Christians, is that we know where our allegiances lie and we don't betray them. We're loyal to Christ, and we're loyal to our brothers and sisters in the church.
And this might be the first and maybe last time I ever liturgy post on the word fitly spoken. But it makes me think of also like the Kyrie at the beginning of the service, where you say, Lord, have mercy, calling on him to have mercy. Well, that Kyrie in Greek is itself a kind of confession. It's basically saying that Jesus is the Lord and not Caesar and not any of these other things. You're basically saying you are the Lord. You are the one in control. You are the one who is over all things. And so just that simple act itself is a declaration of your allegiance to the Lord. Yes, it calls on him for mercy too, and we shouldn't overlook that. But just the fact that we call him Lord is itself a confession.
Yeah, and so I thought you were supposed to be a pietist, Zelwyn, and you're not supposed to know what the liturgy is. I thought those things were mutually exclusive.
I'm a churchly pietist.
Oh, all right. But to go back to chapter 13, so if you don't have the mark of the beast, you don't have access to the marketplace of the beast. So what do you have access to? Well, if you're part of this 144,000, you have the mark of the Lamb and his Father's name, you have access to Mount Zion, right? So you have those two. Zion is opposed to Babylon, or what's going to be described as Babylon just a little bit later in the book. And again, I think that's just a great way to picture it here. Those who are excluded from Babylon have a home in Zion.
That's a beautiful picture too. And I also think it's significant as we come to the end of this segment that the Lamb is standing on earth. We most of the time when we see him in the book of Revelation, he's standing up in heaven. He's standing before the throne. We have the angels and the elders and the living creatures surrounding him, kind of a thing, and worshiping him. But at this point, the Lamb is now standing on earth, on Mount Zion, and in among the 144,000. So, what do we make of that?
Well, I think it's a great point. The last time, so the Lamb as a representation of Jesus, the last time we had heard about Jesus in this vision anyways, was that he was taken up, right? He ascended into heaven and sat down at the right hand of the Father. But then you have John zooms in on what the beast is up to. And so now all of a sudden, the question comes up, well, how is the church going to survive the opposition that they're facing? How is the church going to survive when you've got the sea beast and the land beast and the dragon at work in the world and the image of the beast? And it's all pretty gloomy. But then, all right, well, here's the answer, is that the Lamb has not departed, but he takes his stand. It sounds like Psalm 2 kind of stuff, right? The nations rage and the heathens plot in vain, but the Lord has established his king on Mount Zion. And the earthly ministry of Christ, his kingdom, it may not be of this world, but it is advancing in this world.
Yeah. And I really do think that is something that we should hold on to as well, because it's very easy for us to become pessimistic, to become very gloomy, as you've been saying. Think that the beast and Satan and the dragon, and it seems like they're winning, right? It always seems like they're the ones who are overcoming. They're the ones who are persecuting the saints, and it seems like there isn't a whole lot that we can do. It can very often seem like we're alone here on earth, that God is, he's off somewhere, but he's not really with us. It can feel that way sometimes, but Revelation 14 makes it very clear here that no, God is not far off. God is here among his people. He's in the trenches. He's fighting with us and for us and being with us always, so that no matter what is happening, no matter how bad things get, even when we're excluded from Babylon, even when we're excluded from the economic systems of the beast, yet we still have Christ with us. And I think that that's something that should give us comfort no matter what.
Yeah, and in the next part of chapter 14, you're going to see maybe if the beginning here is about the worship assembly, what it's going to transition into then is the witness that the church gives, and that there is a victory, and we can talk about whether that victory occurs in time or only at the end of time, and kind of how the way that you understand that, I think, is significant for how you read the book of Revelation.
Well, very good. Well, with that, we need to take our first break, so we'll be right back with more A Word Fitly Spoken right after this. Welcome back. You're listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide here today with David Appold talking about Revelation 14. So in the previous segment, David, we had finished talking about the first 5 verses of this chapter, but now we want to dig into the next section, verses 6 through 13. So can you give us a general overview of what's happening in this particular segment?
Yeah, you're going to see eventually it's going to get to the point where the Lamb's wrath is going to be described as kind of trampling down, or well, that comes at the very end of the book. But the Lamb emerges victorious over those who receive the mark of the beast. And the way that it's, again, in the book of Revelation, it's kind of I don't know what the right word to use is, Zelwyn, kind of herky-jerky, or it jumps over things. And so it's never directly says, then the 144,000 engaged in warfare with those who had the mark of the beast. But what is described, I think, is the preaching ministry of the church, the witness that the church gives to the world. And in that, we see a apocalyptic vision of the warfare that the church carries out. And the outcome of that warfare is the victory of the saints.
Yeah. Well, and especially as you get towards the end of this segment, you have, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. So, I mean, it is preaching. It is a declaration, especially to the world, and we'll see this in the first part, but it is a preaching with a purpose, and that it eventually will end up in the blessedness of the church and the call for endurance as well. So we'll get into those details. But so let's focus on the angels themselves here as the first way of dealing with specifics.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Yeah. So the 144,000 have been surrounding the Lamb, and then all of a sudden you get this description. This is what I mean by it. It shifts. These angels are going out, and John sees 3 angels. And most of our listeners are probably going to be familiar with this part of the book of Revelation from the readings on Reformation Day, because the first angel who goes out flies overhead, and he's got an eternal gospel, and so he's proclaiming this eternal gospel, right? So this is what I mean by, here is a vision of the angel, which certainly John sees a heavenly angel, but it's just the angel is a figure of the preaching ministry of the church. Do you think that's fair to say, Zelwyn, or do you want me to kind of spell that out a little bit more?
No, I think that's very fair, because you'll notice, especially in verse 6, it says, gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth. So this proclamation is not given to the church only. I want to say only, but it is something that is proclaimed to all the world. It is something that even those who have, worshipped the beast, those who have taken the mark, they hear this message too, which is why, the calling to fear God, give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. That, of course, will be an aroma of death to them because of their sin. But it is still a message which must be proclaimed. The gospel is not something to be proclaimed only in the church. It is, within the walls of the church or something like that. It is something which must be proclaimed to the whole world.
Yeah, and trying to identify this angel, I think it's a mistake. Now, maybe you have a different opinion there, Zelwyn, and maybe our listeners want to say, want to stick with the Reformation exegesis here and say, no, it is Martin Luther, and he is. I mean, that comes from, I think it was Johannes Bugenhagen's funeral sermon for Luther. Am I remembering this correctly?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that he identified Luther as this particular angel, and that's why it gets read on Reformation Day. I just think it's a mistake to specify that. And that this gets back into something that we had discussed before on this series of looking for the book of Revelation as kind of a roadmap for the entire history of the church. I think that when you do that and you specify, well, this is this particular man at this particular time in the history of the church, what you end up doing then is you limit how you can apply this passage to the church presently or to the church prior to the Reformation. So if we take the angel as embodying the entire ministry of the church, the witness of the church, sure, Luther is a preacher and a significant one in that. I'm not trying to downplay the great reformer, the blessed Dr. Martin Luther of blessed memory. May peace be upon him. But what I'm saying is that it's not only Luther who carries that out.
Well, and as you said, the exegesis that leads to this identification is this assumption that Revelation is kind of a play-by-play through history. So if you start in Revelation 1, that's towards the time of the beginning of the church. And by the time we get to Revelation 21, that is the end of history. So it's kind of just a straight line. But that was a very common way of interpreting this book in the time of the Reformation. I mean, Luther interprets it this way. Melanchthon interprets it this way. Bugenhagen apparently interprets it this way. And so it's always this trying to figure it out, where are we within the scheme of the book of Revelation? At what point are we within the book? And I do think that is problematic, as you said, because it does end up leading you perhaps into some very strange conclusions, or as you said, very forced conclusions. But I do like the way that you put it, in the sense that, Luther is not here, but he's just not the only one in consideration.
Yeah, it's overly specific. And what happens when you get overly specific is that certain parts of the book then become, if, say, for instance, the mark of the beast. If the mark of the beast is only about, what happens at the time of Nero, Caesar, or at the time of Diocletian, or at the time of the Pope in the Middle Ages, well, then when we read it now, well, that stuff already happened. And I'm saying this for Willie's sake, because I know this is a point he likes to make, that these things are not just, yes, you can see instances where, okay, this comes to a fore in church history, but the book of Revelation it's not inapplicable to us. It's not just saying all this stuff already happened, you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's meant to call us to perseverance now and to say, all right, these things continue to happen in the life of the church. Yeah, the gospel must continue to be preached. It's an eternal gospel, and the church has that role to play as that angel, the angelic voice preaching.
Yeah. Nor is it something that is inapplicable because it's all in the future, right? And that's kind of
Right.
the other extreme that we're trying to avoid here, to make it all this futurist kind of thing. This is all going to happen eventually, but maybe not to us kind of a thing. No, the point is that this is something that is true for us as it's true for every Christian in every time.
Now, the message that the angel preaches is maybe an interesting formulation of the gospel. You know, he doesn't preach the message of justification, does he? He at least not in those, at least not that specific. It's just a call to fear God, the true God. So it's a call to worship the true God. And we could say that within that is what we would say is more specifically the gospel of the forgiveness of sins in Jesus Christ, and that his righteousness is credited to you, by the judicial decree of the Father. I wouldn't oppose any of that, but it is just interesting to note the gospel is formulated this way: fear God, give him glory,
and worship him. And I think that's an excellent point, because for whatever reason, we as Lutherans have basically come to the conclusion that the gospel is really only that very specific formulation, to the point where sermons will very often put it in exactly those terms. And I'm not saying that I haven't done this too, that we talk about the forgiveness of sins, and we should. That is the gospel. But we have a very, I don't know if you want to call it narrow understanding of the gospel. Does that make sense?
Yeah, maybe rigid. That's the way that I would think about it. Is like, if the message of the gospel is, the forgiveness of sins, well, then this angel is not preaching the gospel, because he doesn't talk about your sins are forgiven for Jesus' sake, at least not explicitly. And
right.
What I think we're saying is that is part of the message, but that is not the only way to preach the gospel.
Well, let's ask it this way. What is the ultimate purpose of the forgiveness of sins? What is the ultimate purpose of salvation? If we think of salvation purely in human terms and kind of even individualistic terms, we can very often end up thinking that it's like, well, I've been forgiven my sins and I'm going to go to heaven, and that's the gospel. That's kind of the whole purpose. That's the whole reason of why we're here at all. But I think that's actually a little bit, I'm going to say narrow again, because I like to be a little bit more charitable, I suppose. But it's narrow. I'm just giving you grief.
Yeah, that's fine.
But it's narrow because I think the ultimate purpose of salvation, the whole reason why we are being saved, is because it glorifies God. And for that reason, we can see here the gospel itself. We are giving him glory because he is the one who has delivered us. He is the one who has saved us. He is the one who has done all things necessary. And when we get to heaven, we're not going to be sitting around saying, oh, how nice this is, kind of a thing, just purely in comfort kind of terms. But we're going to be worshiping God and giving him glory forever for the things that he has done.
So you're saying we're going to glorify God and enjoy him forever?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, and I know that this is language that we don't typically use as Lutherans, and that's fine. When we think of the gospel in purely individual kind of terms, which is what I was getting at, I think we can kind of get away from what the Bible often speaks of, as the glory of God. Think of the Old Testament, for example, where God says, I'm not going to save you because of you, because you're so good. I'm going to do it for the sake of my holy name, for my own glory, kind of a thing. So we see in it that this is all for his glory.
Yeah, I think that's right on. So the I don't know. I mean, we could go on down. I mean, think about how Jesus prays at the end of in the book of John. He wants, Father, glorify me now with the glory that I shared with you before the foundation of the world. And the Father responds with, I have glorified and will glorify. So we don't want to get into this position where we say, well, the theology of glory, I know that's a phrase that I'm supposed to oppose. And therefore,
Hmm.
any talk of glory is somehow wrong, because then you'd have to take exemption with what Jesus says. And we want our terms to be defined biblically. So to glorify God, to be called back to fear the Lord, that is what happens when the gospel is preached. And yeah, we can get more specific, and we should, and we need to, about what is all contained within this message. But we don't just want to get into a place where we kind of have these knee-jerk responses of fear God, give him glory. That just sounds like law. So this must not be. How is that preaching the gospel?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's really, as you said, what we need to avoid is this kind of just knee jerk. I hear this, that sounds like this, therefore it must be bad.
Yeah.
We just need to have a broader and I hate to say looser, but a wider understanding of what the gospel is in many cases,
Yeah.
because it's all contained into one thing.
More robust. I said rigidity earlier. It's not rigidity. I just mean that we get it. We all do this. I'm not pointing fingers at, there's certain phrases that just, that you hammer on, and there's certain phrases like the forgiveness of sins that those should be beloved phrases. But that's not the only way the Bible speaks about salvation. That's not the only way the Bible speaks about the gospel. So to have some robustness to our understanding and the mental flexibility to not just be pigeonholed into it must be formulated this way, or I don't know what to do with it. That's all we're saying.
Yeah, I like it. Well, I mean, let's look at the other angels too. I feel like they're
Okay.
kind of getting.
Yeah, so the first angel preaches the gospel. The second angel comes, and I think, let's put it this way. He says, here's the outcome. And it's the outcome for those who reject it. So the second angel announces what happens is that the city of Babylon is fallen. Cue the music, right, Zelwyn? Babylon is
Beautiful.
fallen. And that's basically all he says. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality.
Which I would point out is also an expression of gospel.
Go on.
Because very often, especially in the Old Testament, when you have God coming to his people, the message that he proclaims is not only that I'm going to deliver you and I'm going to bring you back and put you in your own land. The message is often your enemies are going to be defeated.
Yeah.
All of these people who afflicted you will come to an end. And that's what we see happening here. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great is a wonderful gospel message, because it's basically saying the dragon, the beasts, the whole system is going to fall, and we can rejoice knowing that God is in his holy temple, right? That he is the one in control. He is the one who is victorious. So yeah, this is gospel too.
And later in the book, we're going to get more detail about this, about the vision. You're going to get a lot more on the whore of Babylon. So I would just say maybe let's save that for a later time.
Yeah.
But to go off of your point, that's why we started this episode with that reading from the man who comes from Edom and Basra, who has trampled out the vineyard of God's wrath. How is that good news? Well, it's because he has defeated. You have real enemies, Christians, right? The church has enemies. And yes, we want all to be converted, but we also know that not all will be. And so there has to be the flip side of salvation is that there's judgment on those who reject Christ.
Yeah. Amen. Indeed. Well, and then the third angel, to just kind of keep moving forward here, comes in and he proclaims, well, he gives the law after the gospel, David, and we can't listen to him for that reason.
Yes. So he describes in more detail what happens to those who were part of that Babylon, right? So you get the second angel announces it, hey, the Babylon has fallen, and then the third angel says, here's what happened to them, and I think we immediately go to the end, the final day here, Judgment Day, and I think that's it's hard to deny that would be the right interpretation, don't you think, Zelwyn? Because it sounds like such a final kind of judgment. I guess the only thing I would say here is to go back to how we described that first angel and not being overly specific, that God's judgments do get revealed in history. And even though they're not the final permanent judgment, things like the destruction of the temple really were the revelation of God's judgment, and the downfall of heathen things, pagan systems. I think we should see those as the outcome, the gospel going through the world, and God does put down in time. Sometimes God does vindicate his saints.
Absolutely. We're going to go a little long in this section because it's our podcast and we can do what we want. But I do think that the proclamation of, these who have worshiped the beast, those who have received the mark, they're going to suffer God's wrath. Yes, that is something that, like you said, is going to happen at all times, because God is going to vindicate his people at all times. But this is, as we're going to see a little bit later in this chapter too, that there is a finality to it, right? Because the smoke of their torment is going up forever and ever. They have no rest. This is a clear declaration of hell. I mean, yeah. to use the plain language, right?
Yeah, and maybe we should make sure that we kind of do away with sometimes we say things like, well, what is hell? It's the absence of God, right? Maybe you've said that, Zelwyn, but here it's described as the presence of the Lamb, right? They will drink his wrath in his presence. So I think we should just, we should be a little careful with how we say these things. And I get the instinct for that. Nobody wants to picture Jesus as like enjoying eternal conscious torment, but that is the way his victory is described here, that he conquers his enemies, and in his presence he makes them, every knee must bow to him, some in worship, but those who opposed him will bow to him in fear.
Yeah. Well, and I think maybe the way to put it is Jesus isn't getting some sick pleasure out of this, nor are the angels getting some sick pleasure out of this, as if it's like, this twisted, demented, I'm really enjoying doing this to you kind of a thing. Really what it is a recognition of his victory, as you put it, that those who have been opposed to him, Jesus is getting, he's getting victory over them, and they are getting what they deserve. Yeah. And so God in this sense is carrying out what is right. He's doing what is right, and what is right in this case is giving judgment. And we sometimes think of judgment as this kind of wrong thing, as this bad thing or whatever, and that's why we want to I don't know. It's why we don't talk about it. But the judgment of God is good. It is righteous. It is holy. And so for them to be tormented in this way because of their sins, because of their rejection, is justice. It is righteousness. It is holiness. I mean, God is doing what is right in this case, and that's why they're being tormented in this way.
Yeah, so then the final little section here, the last couple of verses are, so you get the description of those who had the mark of the beast, and now those who had the mark of the Lamb are it's a call for endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God, who have faith in Jesus, and then you get a declaration of blessing on them. So the declaration of God's judgment comes, but now the declaration of his benediction, his blessing on the saints. Blessed are those who die in the Lord. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, for they have rest.
Well, it ended on the gospel, so we're okay now. So
Yeah. Except that the vision goes on, but
right.
at least in this section, you have, and I'll tie a bow on it here. You had the vision on Mount Zion. Then in the middle section here, you have the war being carried out, and you have the outcome of that war. And the reason that's important for the church that John was writing to and the church of all times is so that there would be a call for endurance, that there wouldn't be apathy in the church, that there wouldn't be, I think apathy is the best word for it, that we wouldn't just sort of throw our hands up and say, well, it's just really bad and there's nothing we can do. Those who labor in the Lord don't labor in vain. We labor for a victory.
The third angel's message is also a call for us to watch, to pay attention, because, if we give in to worshiping the beast, if we receive the mark out of fear, out of, a desire to not suffer or something like that, then we have not done what we're supposed to do. And so that's why there's also a call for endurance. Yeah, it's going to be hard, but at the same time, we don't want to do the alternative, which is to fall into this. But with that, we do need to take our second break, so we'll be right back with more on A Word Fitly Spoken. Welcome back. This is A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide with David Appold, continuing our discussion on the book of Revelation, chapter 14. So we've talked about most of the chapter up to this point, David, but now we need to look at the final segment, verses 14 to 20. So can you give us an overview again, and then we'll talk about specifics?
Sure. It's a harvest scene. Okay, so you go from the Lamb with his 144,000 worshiping him to these three angels in succession. And now Jesus here is seen as, John describes him as one like a son of man seated on the clouds. And he sends out his angels to put in the sickle. And so this is what I mean by the harvest scene. There's going to be two depictions of a harvest. One is of the grain, and one is of grapes. So this is what's described here, and what is seen is I think again here you have certainly our minds are drawn to the end of all things, and it's fitting, in chapters 12 through 14, you have this vision of the church's war with the dragon and the beast, and now as we come to the end of that vision, John is seeing the final outcome of these things. So it all ends with a harvest of grain and of grapes.
Yeah. So if we're looking at specifics, then we meet the one like the Son of Man seated on the cloud. And how is he depicted? I mean, what is the imagery here of clouds and crowns and stuff like that? What's this all mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth paying attention to the changes in. So Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. At one point, he's also the Lamb of God with the 7 spirits going out from him. Here, he's described in like Daniel's vision, the Son of Man on the clouds, but he has a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. So sort of similar to the way that John the Baptist describes Jesus in his preaching, that he's coming with the oh gosh, now it just dropped
Winnowing
out of,
fork.
yeah, with the winnowing fork in his hand. He's depicted here in his final glory, his eschatological glory. He is and it's worth pointing out, he has the sickle in his hand, but then he sends out his angels to actually do his work on his behalf. So he is the authority carrying it out through his servants.
Well, but the angel calls out to him and says, "Put in your sickle," which kind of sounds like he's giving a command here. I mean, what do we make of that? Why does the angel call out to him to do this?
Yeah, I think you have some good Trinitarian theology there, helps to kind of unpack that, so that it's not that Jesus is the servant of the angel, but the angel is bringing the command of the Father, and the Son is he's carrying out the Father's command. So it's sort of like the way that we would explain, Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, and they rule together. So the work of the Trinity is one. And so even though, yes, the angel tells Jesus to do it, and Jesus does it, he then also, a little bit later, it says, another angel came out of the temple, and he too had a sharp sickle. So who's the one who has the sickle, and who's the one performing the harvest? Well, it is the Father's command, it's the Son's doing, and it's carried out by the angels. I just don't think we should see these things as opposed to each other. But the Trinitarian theology that underlies this helps you understand that the works of the Trinity are one. They're united.
Sure. I'm not disagreeing with that at all, but do you think you could also see it as a request rather than a command? Put in your sickle and reap, O Lord, kind of a thing?
I hadn't thought of that, but when you say it that way, it makes me think of the angel who brought the prayers of the saints. Is this where you're going? That the angels, the angels earlier in the book of Revelation brought the incense of the prayers of the saints into heaven. And so if that's what you're getting at, I think that fits quite well, that the angel, here is the prayer of the saints, and the Son of Man gladly carries it out. The answer is yes.
Well, and I'm not saying that the other thing is totally off either. I think it's a both and kind of a thing, because we can and we should, as John does actually at the end of the book, pray for the coming of the Lord. We should pray for him to return to carry out his judgments, and he will do what is right. So when he comes, in that sense, it is not only because he comes when it was determined to, but he's also coming in answer to the prayers of his people. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, I think it's a both and. So I'm bridging the gap here, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Sure. So it says that the time for the harvest is ripe, or the time to reap is ripe. And this, what does that mean? How do you know when it's the ripe time for the harvest? This is it's reminiscent of the way that God spoke to Abraham back before he came into the land of Canaan. He gives him the promise that one day his descendants would come out of Egypt and would gain possession of the land. But the iniquity of the Amorites, it might say all the other ites too, had not yet been filled up. Right. And so I think that language, God has set a day and a time and a limit for sin, but it hasn't reached that point yet. But there is this call for when the time is ripe that the Son of Man will put in the sickle. He's not late. He's not slow, as some count slowness.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we need to emphasize again and again, that the judgment comes at the right time because of the limit that has been placed onto sin. This idea of sin being ripe, of the harvest being at the right time, kind of a thing, of the harvest of judgment being at the right time, is basically saying that God has determined that it will come to this point. The number of sins will come to this number, sort of a thing. They'll fulfill out their allotment, and then the judgment will come. And the reason why I think we should emphasize that is because we can think of sin as being this kind of out of control, the world's just going downhill, everything's just bad. Why is it getting so bad kind of a thing? That God isn't really in control of anything.
Yeah.
But when we recognize that the judgment comes at the right time, at the time of the harvest, because the iniquity has been filled up, then we recognize that no, God isn't, just sitting ignoring us. He's actually waiting for the right time to carry out the judgment when all these things will be at their fullness, kind of a thing, right?
Yeah. And the image of a great harvest at the end, is part of Christ's own preaching. You can think of the parable of the weeds and the wheat. You have both of them growing up together, and at the end comes the final separation. So he permits, he knows that there's weeds among the wheat, but he tells his angels not to go out until it's the right time. And that image of harvest has both the note of judgment for the weeds, or for those who will be judged, but it also has the note of salvation, that when the grain has grown up, if you think of St. Paul saying that the church is the field of God, right? We are part of that grain. Christ is the first fruits, and we are the full harvest. The saints will be gathered. So it's both, the harvest image has both a note of separation, but it also has the gathering of the grain into the barn. It's a great double-sided image, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and something else to mention with that too is that evil and wickedness and iniquity, they also come to fruition. There is a growth in wickedness in that sense, because we usually think of faith as being a kind of like a tree or like a plant or something that grows. Well, wickedness also grows. And so we see towards the end of all things, the fullness of sin, the man of lawlessness coming into the forefront, kind of a thing. That basically what this is all leading to is the final expression of that sin. So yeah, things seem to get worse in that sense, but at the same time, they come to fruition, they come to the end, and when they are at their ripest, when they come into their time, kind of a thing, then the judgment comes.
Yeah, and I guess we should, the reason that we are paying more attention to the judgment aspect of harvest here is because that's what happens in Revelation.
Right.
I just made the point. This image could be used as God is gathering in his grain, and that comes out in Christ's teaching. But it can also, and here in Revelation, it's going to focus on what he does with the grapes. So the ripening of these grapes, are they good grapes or are they bad? This sounds very much like Isaiah, the song of Isaiah chapter 5, where, the Lord looked for good grapes, but behold, only wicked grapes grew up. Well, how do you harvest wicked grapes? What do you do with them? It says here that he's not going to let them keep growing. He's not going to let them take over, but he harvests them and he destroys them. Right. That's what you do with bad grapes.
Right. Well, and I think why grapes, kind of a thing. It made me think of earlier when it is talking about Babylon is making the nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And so grapes in this sense are a negative image in this part of the book, because grapes lead to wine, leads to drunkenness. So I think in this sense, grapes here are a representation of the sins, right? And it is these grapes which will be trodden and destroyed, and the blood will flow from them. So I think it's just nice little connections between the various parts of this book, don't you think?
Oh, of course. And I think that's one of the things that we are trying to accomplish with this series is to not just focus on sort of our favorite parts of the book, or I've used the word you can get fixated or fascinated by one part of the book of Revelation. And what happens then is you lose its connection in with the rest of the book. And so that's a great point to make, is the connection between Babylon and the grapes of Babylon and the stomping out of those grapes. And so how this little vision wraps up then in chapter 14 is the wine press, the grapes are harvested, they're dropped into the wine press, and then they're stomped out. So the grapes receive the wrath of God. And here's where you get, we are opposed, are we not, Zelwyn, to the singing the grapes of wrath. We do not like to sing that song. And I don't just say that because I'm in Kentucky. But that is not a depiction of, it's not the battle hymn of the Republic. That's my point here.
Right.
This is the final judgment.
Right. Well, and the fact that these grapes are thrown into the wine press outside of the city, that those who are wicked, the grapes in this sense, are cast out of the city, and that is where they are trodden. So, I mean, you do have this imagery of, being thrown out, the outer darkness, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth, that sort of thing. And also that they will be trodden underfoot. I mean, that's also imagery used within the Bible, that Christ will put all enemies under his feet. So, I mean, this is all connected. I mean, it's a very picturesque way of talking about the victory of Christ and talking about the judgment which is to come.
Yeah. And so the final vision here is of a river. And so this is going to come back in on the total sort of flip side with the river of life. But here you have a river of blood that comes out of this wine press. And it's described this way: the blood flowed from the wine press as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. So you get some actual numerical measurements here. And trying to figure out exactly the meaning here. I think the 1,600. I know you're a great fan of numerological things, Zelwyn. So what's the 1,600, and what's going on with the up to the horse's bridle? How do we want to understand that?
Oh, you're going to make me do this. Okay.
Well, I want to hear what you say, and then I'll correct you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a lot of things going on here. And I think the first thing to note is, like you said, I do think that this is a kind of river. I used to think of it as just kind of radiating out from the wine press, but I do think that a river is a very good way to look at this, because then you can see connections to other things. The contrast with the river of life, for example, or the river which comes out from the vision of the temple in Ezekiel, where you also get depth measurements. Eventually it's described as being over his head, kind of a thing. Yeah. So, I mean, you have this imagery of a kind of the inverse of the river of life, which is the river of blood, the river of judgment, the river of wrath. And the fact that it is blood recalls the judgment laid upon Egypt, when the Nile was turned to blood. The height of the blood, I mean, is described as a description of, the severity of this wrath, that this is happening to such an extent that it's coming out, 4, 5, 6 feet deep, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And going on for 1,600 stadia. And the 1,600, in this case, I think you can see it as a twice 40, like 40 times 40. And 40, of course, being a number of judgment, right? The 40 days of the wilderness, the 40 years of the wilderness, the 40 days of the flood. It is an expression of God's wrath. And so all of these things together show that this is the outcome of God's judgment, that he is tying all these things together into one image, which shows the full extent of his wrath against sin.
Yeah, and then he brings it to an end. And I think I would agree with what you said there. The connection, or the contrasting it with the river of life, especially the one that Ezekiel sees, is great here, because that river, the river of life, gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and it goes out it goes all the way into the sea. And if you remember in Ezekiel, it actually continues into the sea and it changes the sea. So it is a never ending, it's kind of an infinite river, the river of life. Here, this river it's not getting any deeper. Yes, there's a severity to it, right? It's high and it's long. 1,600 stadia comes out to 180 miles or so. So it's not like God's wrath is no big deal, but it's not getting any deeper, and it does have an end, in contrast to the river of life, which is infinite. Now, I realize when I say that could almost sound like a universalistic hope, and that's not what I mean. I just mean that the wrath of God it's in contrast to his mercy or to his salvation. It's not as impressive. Is that fair to say, Zelwyn?
Well, I know what you mean, but it made me think immediately of carrying out the judgment to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Yeah, I mean, God's wrath is, I guess you could say, limited, but we understand limited in the sense that, it's not what he really wants for his creation. He does it because it's right, but it's not his will. I hate to put it that way because
I think you said it better earlier. You said there's not some sort of sadistic pleasure that he takes. It is
right.
Just, and it is permanent. I mean, nothing that we're saying here is meant to say like at some point he's going to say, all right, enough is enough, guys. But the river of his judgment, let's put it this way, it pales in comparison to the river of life. And the river of life that's where we draw our hope and our comfort from.
Yeah. You could even call this the river of death.
Yeah.
If you really want to make the contrast. So, well, David, we're coming to the end of the episode. I think we've had some good discussions on this chapter. Is there anything else you want to say before we close it out?
No, just I think seeing chapter 12, we get the readings on All Saints Day, St. Michael and all not All Saints Day, St. Michael and all angels. You get that passage in chapter 12. Reformation Day, you get a little bit of this chapter 14, but seeing the whole, this whole vision, 12, 13, 14, as kind of the heart of the book of Revelation, I think is just what I would kind of re-impress on people. And so read it all together, take it all together.
Very good. Well, this has been A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm your host, Zelwyn Heide, here today with David Appold. If you like what you heard and you want to hear more, please check us out at wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or Twitter @wordfitly. God love you, and God bless.
Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." Revelation 14:12 and 13.